It's the only thing that kept him going as he was navigating the mountain.
Okay. All right. Lou Bean here. Welcome back to Burning Questions from the Blaze Project. It's been a minute. As a developing wildland firefighter and a sawyer, I have found myself looking for mentors and inspiration to grow towards. And though there have been many human folks in the fire world worthy of consideration, I found myself in the last year gravitating towards one of the best firefighters on the continent, a 4-foot, 40-pound semi-aquatic mammal. Folks who've been trapped in a patrol truck with me on fire assignment can attest to my uncanny ability to shoehorn beavers into nearly every conversation about land management, wildfire, and restoration. But I find that when people see the massive impact that these animals can have, they usually leave the conversation just as excited as I am about their role in ecosystem restoration and conservation. One of the most helpful resources in my journey towards Beaver Believer has been the book Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. And I'm so excited to be sharing my conversation with conservation journalist Ben Goldfarb, author of this award-winning book. In addition to traveling around the country for research, being named the author of one of the best books of 2023 by the New York Times, we also happen to call the same Colorado mountain town home, where I was able to sit down and chat with him in person.
My name is Ben Goldfarb. I am an environmental journalist based in Salida, Colorado, and I'm the author of a couple of books, Eager, about beavers, and Crossings, about the science of road ecology.
Describe your eureka moment where you first realized that there was a secret history in life to beavers and their supporters to uncover.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I feel like I was often around beavers growing up. I'm from the Hudson Valley in New York State originally, and so I spent a lot of time in the Catskills and the Adirondacks, you know, pretty beavery places. So I always saw them hiking and camping and canoeing and fishing. I always had a kind of a baseline appreciation of beavers. I thought they were pretty cool critters. But, you know, my full eureka moment, my conversion to the cult of Beaver Believer, that occurred in 2014. I was living in Seattle at the time, working as an environmental journalist, looking for things to write about. And somebody sent me this invitation to a beaver workshop. And I had no idea what that entailed, but it sounded like it could be a story. So I went to this beaver workshop, and it was just one scientist after another getting up to say their piece about why beavers were so important for water quality and drought mitigation and flood attenuation and salmon habitat and wildfire adaptation and all of these incredible ecosystem benefits and services that beavers provide. So it was that conference, that beaver workshop, that fully radicalized me.
Absolutely. That Beaver Believer cult, as you described it, is so funny. It is such a small group of people, but they're so passionate about beavers and what they can do ecosystem services-wise. And I wanted to connect to your experience as a child, too, because I grew up and lived in the Kashlapooter River area.
Oh, cool.
And I feel like beavers, to me, were more of a mythical creature because there had been so much removal because of the fur trade that the historic populations have, not bumped back up to the same level, but there are certainly still beavers in the area. And every time we would see a beaver, which was few and far between, it would be like a magical experience, like seeing some sort of, chupacabra or something crazy. So it's very cool that you come from a place where there's still a good amount of a population left to kind of have those personal experiences with them.
Well, totally. They're wild critters. They're these giant 50-pound rodents with these, flat, scaly paddle tails who cut down trees to build walls and create lakes. When you really think about them objectively, they are just wild animals, for sure.
I mean, yeah, they don't seem that different from almost like a jackalope, when you describe them in that way, just an amalgamation of different animal parts.
Right.
But yeah, so what was the process of researching this book like? You already mentioned sort of conferences and things like that, but in the book you talk a lot about your travel. So I'm curious, what that process was like and what kinds of unexpected experiences you had.
Yeah, so I was really fortunate that people in the Beaververse, the cult of Beaver Believer, were they were so opening and welcoming to me, or open and welcoming to me. I at the start of researching the book, I basically went on Google Scholar and looked for all of the the people who have published a lot about beavers. So scientists like Joe Wheaton at Utah State, and Chris Jordan with NOAA, and Michael Pollack, and other folks like that. So there was kind of that academic piece of research, just talking to lots of the really well published scholars in the field of castorology. And then there's also a kind of a cool social media piece, where I joined Beaver Facebook groups and just said, hey, who wants to talk to me for this book that I'm working on? And one thing kind of led to another, and pretty soon I had this great network of contacts, so many of whom welcomed me into the field. That was the really fun, exciting part, was just how many folks working on Beavers said, hey, come out to Washington or Oregon or Utah or Colorado and check out this awesome project where we're documenting beaver benefits in field settings. So that was really the great gift of the project, of the book, was just the chance to visit all of these leading figures in the beaver world and spend time with them. And as you say, the world of Beaver Believer it's kind of a small little cosmos, but it's actually growing really rapidly. In 2016-17, when I was really working on this book, you could sort of reasonably talk to every person in the field of castorology, and in the 7 or 8 years since then, it's just exploded so dramatically, and now there are hundreds of people working on these animals. So you're right that it's a small world, but it's a really fast growing world. And if I was trying to write this book again today, it would just be impossible to talk to everybody.
Totally. And I'm one of those recent converts too, and
yeah.
I've worked with some of the same people that you've worked in the Colorado area that are associated with the Beaver Institute here.
Yeah.
And they knew you. I'd mentioned that the reason I got into it was because of your book and stuff too.
Cool.
So everybody still sort of knows each other and stuff. But I think one of the things that is so gratifying about doing this kind of work, and why I imagine a lot of people have converted to being Beaver Believers in the last few years, is because when you go in to do the Beaver Dam analog work, or I would imagine less common in Colorado, but more common in other places, those beaver reintroductions and stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of restoration work takes so long to see the fruits of your labor, but you put in a Beaver Dam analog, you see the spread of that water almost immediately.
Totally.
And then those ecosystem impacts just keep coming and coming and coming as years go on. And so there is that piece where you can train volunteers to do it, and you don't have to devote your professional life to beavers to love it. So that grassroots piece is pretty cool to see, especially growing in Colorado too with volunteerism.
Totally, yeah, and you're so right about the incredibly fulfilling nature of this work. I've had a chance to go out with Mark Beardsley from Ecometrics. You probably know based on the TV, and you're right. We're building beaver dam analogs, and in the course of an afternoon, you can see these incredible ponds and wetlands instantly forming on the floodplain, and you're right. It's incredibly gratifying, and it's just so visibly beneficial and tangible. You just spread water onto the landscape, and there's something that just feels so viscerally right about that, and that, I think that's the other cool thing about BDA construction, is that it just taps into this ancient, deep-seated human impulse to manipulate water, right? We're all kind of beavers at heart. We all grew up in sandboxes, digging little channels and, sending rainfall rushing around the playground. And, beaver dam analogs are, in some sense, tapping into that really deep-seated instinct.
I have to imagine, too, that's sort of why we connect with beavers, too. We see a little bit of ourselves in them, as they are ecosystem manipulators, and we are as well. And I just want to say, for people who are just listening, BDAs, essentially, imagine a big woven basket with big posts that are driven super far into the ground in wetland areas, usually in super channelized streams that you're trying to spread the water out, spread the surface area of the water out, and increase the water table. So imagine basically big willows woven between posts. I'll include an image of that in the show notes as well. But so now that we've started talking about some of this work, I want to talk about beavers specifically and their impacts and why this even matters. So what challenges have beavers faced historically? Because beavers used to live all over the United States, and they don't now. What happened?
Yeah, the biggest challenge is that we freaking killed them for hundreds of years. Really that challenge, kind of begins with the industrial fur trade, right, which starts in the early 1600s in New England and spreads really rapidly west and south across the continent. And, we don't really know how many beavers lived in North America historically, but, based on various estimates by naturalists and some more recent, geomorphological studies, I think it's pretty safe to say that there were hundreds of millions of beavers on this continent, hundreds of millions of acres of ponds and wetlands that they created. I did a little bit of back of the envelope math in the book, and proposed that beavers might have impounded a sort of an area of land the size of Arizona and Nevada put together. I'm not a statistician; I'm just a journalist, kind of making stuff up. But it was certainly there's no question that these were just incredibly abundant, ubiquitous animals, and you read trappers' diaries and explorers' accounts and railroad surveys. Lewis and Clark talk about seeing, beaver dams up every tributary of the Missouri as far as the eye can see to the mountains. There are explorers describing crossing, what is today Indiana, and not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers had just ponded everything, right? So, we don't know exactly how many beavers were out there, but, I think there's no question that this continent was once a much greener, bluer, wetter, lusher, more biodiverse place thanks to these incredible animals. And then we just set about, systematically annihilating them, right? By the middle of the 19th century, you would have been really hard pressed to find a beaver, anywhere in Colorado, or the whole of the lower 48 for that matter. By 1900, these animals were sort of, functionally extinct in the lower 48. They were, kind of hanging on in Yellowstone and up in Canada and a couple other places, but they were pretty scarce. So that's the biggest challenge, is that we took this once ubiquitous, incredibly abundant animal and brought it pretty close to the brink of extinction.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's the fur trade piece where you hear a lot of people talk about a lot of animals that we hunted for pelts as sort of being this renewable resource, where there were so many of them in the case of the bison and the beaver and all these things that there was no way to imagine that we would ever run out of them because they were so ubiquitous, like you said. But then also, too, I feel like it's worth mentioning as well, wetlands are not places where humans love to hang out. It's not very conducive to what we enjoy about hanging out in a place, but also for economic reasons, too. And agricultural reasons specifically, draining those wetlands to make use of that land, and that sort of resentment towards beavers hanging on in agriculture even today, being one of the things that, not even historically, but currently, we're still sort of fighting that cultural battle over beavers.
Totally right. I think you put your finger on it, which is that there are kind of two challenges, right? There's the historic challenge of just massive industrial elimination of beavers for their pelts, and then there's the contemporary challenge of beaver conflict, right? And look, that's kind of the unfortunate thing that happened with beavers, right? Is that we wiped them out, in the 19th century, and then in the 20th century, we started to reintroduce these animals, right? And in states including Colorado, we're bringing beavers back, but the problem is that in their absence, we colonized all of the best beaver habitat, right? Those low gradient stream corridors, those broad fertile floodplains, that's where they build their dams, and that's where we put our homes and towns and farms and railroads and roads and power lines and the rest of our infrastructure, right? So, I'd argue that we're often the nuisance species, more than they are, but, there's no question that, as these animals return to landscapes that they inhabited for millions of years, we've taken up a lot of that great beaver habitat, and that's where those conflicts that you're alluding to arise, when they dam and road culverts or irrigation ditches or cut down people's fruit trees or what have you, and so in some ways, I think there's almost been there have been kind of two phases in beaver history. There's this sort of industrial phase where we perceive them entirely as commodities for our economic extraction, and then there's a second phase where we perceive them mostly as nuisances, getting in the way of our activities, and we need to get to that third phase where we perceive them as allies and partners in restoration. And I would say not incidentally, that's how Native people perceived them for thousands of years in North America, right? Tribes like the Blackfeet in Montana considered beavers sacred because they recognized that these animals created, as the Blackfeet historian Rosalind Lapierre put it, created these ecological oases in this arid western landscape, right? And so we need to sort of rediscover that mentality and that relationship, and and perceive these animals as hugely beneficial, as of course they are.
Absolutely. And you sort of touched on this a little bit, but just to get really like specific with it, can you describe for me what the American landscape looks like? Maybe describe like a imaginary, but a specific area that has beavers in it and what that looks like. And then an area that doesn't have beavers in it, what do those streams and wetlands look like today?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that that Mark Beardsley actually talks really well about. But I think that when we, and this is what your question is alluding to, is that when we killed several hundred million beavers, we really internalized this, I would say, often inaccurate perception of what a stream is supposed to look like, right? And I think that we have this idea of a stream being this, single thread, kind of like a sine wave, running through a valley. It's, it's got a gravel or cobble bottom, you could like jump across it. It's like a nice place to catch a brook trout, right? The kind of thing you'd see in, an Orvis catalog or something. When, in reality, these beaver-dominated systems, which we know were so common, in meadows and valleys all over the American West, they were very different systems, right? There's, water just all over the floodplain. It's hard to even say where the stream is because there are just ponds and wetlands and side channels and, eddies and all kinds of complex, slow water features. And, that water is really going from, valley wall to valley wall in many cases. And, and that, again, that's something that, that Joe Wheaton at Utah State has talked about. He's got a great YouTube video about this where, he just kind of blows your mind by showing you that the stream corridor, which again, I think a lot of us perceive as this little, 10-foot wide meandering thread of water is actually the entire valley, because beavers are building those dams and just moving water across the entirety of the floodplain. And that's not something that you'd see in a fly fishing magazine, right? There are dead and dying trees all over the place and tangles of willow, and it's all kind of like chaotic, and the bottom in many places is kind of mucky, and it smells a little like decomposition, right? But we know that those kinds of pond and wetland beaver created systems are profoundly beneficial for all kinds of other species and for us too, and we need to kind of accept them as normal functioning, really healthy systems.
Yeah. Well, and then getting into that too, into those benefits, how has both the reintroduction of beavers, but then also where it's more difficult to reintroduce beavers, the Beaver Dam analogs, how has the reintroduction of these efforts sort of fit into our larger goals for land management, such as fire mitigation and community resilience in a wildfire sense?
Yeah, so the fire piece is so interesting, right? Because that was something that anecdotally people have observed for a very long time, is that, beavers spread water out and, water doesn't burn, right? And so beavers are creating, these fire breaks and fire refuges on the landscape. And, certainly when I was working on this book in, 2015, 16, 17, that was something that I observed anecdotally, right? I went to places like the Methow Valley and, in northern Washington, a very flammable place that's had some huge mega fires over the last decade. And, there would be sites where it would be like one hillside would be black and one hillside would be green, and in between is, guess what, the beaver wetland, right, that basically stopped that fire in its tracks. So that was something that you could sort of observe on the landscape, and people had talked about for a very long time. But nobody had really studied it in any kind of rigorous, peer-reviewed empirical way until Emily Fairfax, who was, working on her PhD at Colorado State and is now at the University of Minnesota, and she's, a great, young, dynamic, charismatic castorologist who's done so much to move the beaver conversation forward, but especially with fire, right? Because she basically did these fantastic peer-reviewed studies in 2020, 2021, basically showing that beavers create these incredibly fire-resilient, fire-resistant landscapes. And they do that in two ways, and this is kind of one of the cool things that comes out of Emily's work, is that yes, they're spreading water out, right? Water doesn't burn, as we all know, but they're also kind of hydrating the whole landscape, right? They're digging these canals, and those canals are kind of spreading water out onto the floodplain, and that water is soaking into the ground and hydrating the soil, and creating these much lusher, greener floodplains. And, as Emily always puts it, we kind of know intuitively that, a green, wet, lush, juicy plant is less likely to burn than a dry, brown, crispy one, right? And that's what beavers are doing. They're great irrigators. And so these canal networks that spread water across the landscape end up being a really important sort of fire resilience component of these beaver complexes. So, what Emily showed in this, really groundbreaking paper that I read about for National Geographic in 2021 was basically that you get these big fires, and those beaver complexes remain fire refuges, right? Or refugia, as Emily calls them. They're these green spots on the landscape, so that all of the critters can basically retreat to those beaver-created strongholds, survive the fire, and then subsequently repopulate the landscape. That's just such a cool effect. There are these little islands of green and these oceans of black, in fires like the East Troublesome Fire. And I think that's another really important piece, is that subsequently, Emily has basically said, okay, we know that these happen that this beaver effect happens during some fires, but does it happen during the mega fires that we're seeing increasingly? And she's shown that yes, beaver ponds are still functional refugia even during mega fires, which is pretty exciting. So that's that's what so I feel like that research that Emily did really changed the game for beavers in a lot of ways. I think that, look, there are so many other beaver benefits, right? These are animals that are, storing water in the face of drought. They're filtering out pollution. They're creating incredible habitat for all kinds of fish and wildlife, right? So there are, so many good arguments on behalf of beavers. But obviously, fire resilience is such a no pun intended, a hot topic right now. And, the ability to make that fire, community safety, beaver connection, I think has brought a lot of new stakeholders to the beaver table.
Totally. And as somebody who's experienced both the suppression side of wildland fire and then also done a lot of the restoration work, I often joke that I feel like sometimes I'm doing more firefighting by working on BDA efforts and learning about things like beavers and wetland restoration than I am even doing the suppression stuff. There's so much firefighting that goes in on the front end of that by keeping those wetland habitats available and healthy. And I also joke too that I'm gonna spend the rest of my career learning to be a better firefighter and a better sawyer with my chainsaw just to be as good as a beaver is on his first day of life. But yeah.
I think that's a good. That's a really good point too about those beaver dam analogs too, right? Is that look, those beaver dam analogs are they're useful, they're important, they're helpful. But, they're never as good as what the beavers make themselves, right? And so to me, oftentimes you'll read, restoration plans and programs, and they'll talk about, building beaver dam analogs, but they won't say anything about beavers themselves, right? And, to me, the whole point of creating a beaver dam analog is basically to pond up some water, capture some soil, rebuild that stream bed a little bit, and create the conditions in which the genuine animals can return to that system and do the work in perpetuity for us, right, for free. Totally.
We just have to get out of their way.
Right? So beaver dam analogs are great, but I'd say they're not substitutes for the beavers. They are inducers for the beavers to return.
Cool. And also too, I just you talked a lot about some of the broader research and stuff, but I'm wondering if there's maybe a certain project, organization, or experience that you had that really inspired and stuck with you during your research.
Man, that's such a good question. I just sort of go back to the person who was kind of my beaver mentor in some ways, who's this guy named Kent Woodruff, who is one of the founders and longtime leaders of the Methow Beaver Project in northern Washington, and now that program is led by Alexa Whipple, who's another fantastic leader and visionary. But Kent was at that Beaver workshop that I mentioned that kind of got me inspired in 2014, I think it was. Kent was one of the speakers there, and he that summer invited me out to the Methow Valley, and he's just an incredibly and so what the Methow Beaver Project does, or at least focused on for a very long time, is they move beavers around, right? They live trap beavers that are causing conflict, and then they move them to headwaters on public lands, and so we went to all of these sites where they moved beavers, and the beavers had just taken over the system and created these incredible reservoirs that had these amazing fire resilience benefits in this very flammable landscape. And Kent was just so good at talking about how beavers change the landscape and benefit the landscape, and what it means to work with them and bring them back. So so being in the Methow Valley and in northern Washington, again, this place that's just been hit by fire after fire after fire, really traumatically in recent years. And here again are these incredible sites where one hillside is black and one hillside is green, and there's a beaver complex in the middle. That was just so powerful.
Totally, and there is this challenge that communities face when they are hit by large mega fires, just even a couple bad fire seasons. There's this trauma that can build in the community, right? This fear around fire. And I think that communities face a pathway where they can make two decisions. They either go down the traditional suppression landscape, they get scared and they invest most of their resources in just fighting fire when it happens really aggressively, or they go the opposite way and they're ready to try something big and new and do things like, reintroducing beavers and, sort of interrogating their relationship with wildfire, their relationship with the land and the landscape, and what we can do differently. And I think you did a great job of highlighting lots of different communities in your book that have made that leap towards the thing that is hard to do, and maybe there's not a playbook for it yet, but they are developing that playbook.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, and look, certainly, right, beaver restoration is not, it's not a silver bullet, obviously. It's, it's just an important tool in the box to use, some very common restoration and wildfire cliches. But, I think that, to me, one of the things that's exciting about beaver restoration, right, is that, we of course know that fire is not some evil, malignant force, right? It's this natural process of restoration and rejuvenation. And, obviously now our fire cycle is woefully out of whack because of historic suppression and climate change. And we know that we need more good fire on the landscape, right? And what does good fire look like? Well, I'm not a fire person, and so you know the answer better than I do. But to me, based on what I've read, it seems like, right, you want heterogeneous fires, right? You want areas of high intensity, areas of low intensity. You want that kind of like black and green matrix on the landscape rather than just 500,000 acres of char.
Yeah, black toothpicks.
Exactly, right. And so beavers create the conditions in which you can have that black and green matrix, right? They're creating those little oases, those little, fire-resistant strongholds on the landscape. And so in some ways, I think that they're great firefighting tools that we can, add back to the landscape. But, they also create an opportunity in some ways, I think, to bring more good fire back because they're, again, creating those green patchy places that we know that we need.
Yeah. So I had an experience yesterday while doing some private mitigation work on a landowner's property in the county. And, we were thinning trees out and removing some fine dead fuel that's super dried out on the, floor of this forested area that's on his property. And I started talking to him because he has this awesome little stream going on and he's got this little beaver pond and stuff on his property. And I was like, oh, have you noticed, are there beavers on your property at all? And he said, no, luckily they took care of themselves. So I'm wondering if maybe we can come up with a response to, there are so many landowners that have this feeling about beavers, right? Some sort of compassionate, empathetic response to landowners who are maybe a little bit skeptical about inviting beavers onto their property.
Yeah, it's it's a really good and important question, because there is this interesting imbalance in a sense, with beavers, where they're providing all of these ecosystem services for the public, right? They're fighting fires, they're improving water quality, they're storing water in the face of drought, et cetera, right? These are services that we all enjoy, but as you're alluding to, their costs are kind of disproportionately borne by private landowners, right? And look, we know that beaver benefits vastly outweigh their costs, right? That there have been places where the ecosystem service value of beavers has been studied, and it's been shown to be in the tens of millions of dollars for single watersheds, right? So okay, they dam in an irrigation ditch once in a while, so be it. But despite being a shameless beaver apologist, I recognize that these can be difficult animals to have on your property potentially, and so I think that's where all of the coexistence work is so important, right? The use of these flow devices, basically these pipe and fence systems that moderate the level of water so that it's not flooding somebody's driveway or field or what have you, or tree fencing, very simple, kind of heavy gauge wire fences we can wrap around ornamental or fruit trees that we want to protect, right? There are all of these all of these coexistence techniques, and the Beaver Institute has a lot of this stuff on their website that allow us to live with these animals, to keep them on the landscape, and solve the conflicts that they do cause, and so providing resources and services to those landowners, I think, is really important. There have been some cool cost share experiments in Montana and elsewhere, where basically nonprofits have shouldered some of the financial burden of putting in these coexistence measures. The Beaver Institute has its Beaver Core program, which basically trains up people to be beaver conflict mitigators, right? So to me, yes, we need to address the conflicts that beavers cause, and to approach them, as you say, with understanding and compassion, because these can be difficult animals to live with at times. But we just have to get away from this mindset where our response to any beaver conflict is killing them.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's still the default, right? We know that the Department of Agriculture, the same, right? The same entity that is responsible for fighting fires on Forest Service land is Wildlife Services, the branch of the USDA, kills between 20 and 25,000 beavers every year, right? Federal government, which is kind of ironic again when you think about how many resources they put towards fighting fires. So we just need to get away from this reflexive, lethal approach and emphasize those coexistence techniques.
Absolutely. And then for the people who don't own land and don't work professionally in wildlife, how can they help support beavers, and by extension then all these ecosystem services that they provide?
Yeah, it's a really good and important question. I would say that one of the cool things about beavers as an issue is in some ways how local they are, right? That these are animals whose fate is determined in large part by county and municipal road crews. These entities that go out there and are responsible for dealing with culverts. Those little inconspicuous pipes that funnel water under roads, right? And every single culvert is a potential beaver conflict area, because if you're a beaver, the road bed is like the world's greatest dam, and the culvert, that pipe, is the leak in the dam, right? And beavers plug leaks. That's what they do. And then the road washes out, and it's this big expensive headache. And so, I don't know what percentage of beaver trapping occurs at conflict culverts, but certainly it's probably the largest cause of beaver conflict in the country. And fortunately, we have lots of, non-lethal ways of protecting those culverts from beavers without resorting to killing the animals. In lots of towns like Breckenridge is pretty good about this sort of thing. They've put in a bunch of culvert protection devices in town. And so, I would say, talk to your county commission, or your town council, or whatever sort of like local political body is, managing the roads in your community, and just say, hey, what do you guys do about beaver conflicts? And have you heard of the Beaver Institute and this, incredible compilation of resources that, that teaches us, how to manage those conflicts non-lethally. So I think that's kind of the cool thing about beavers, again, is that, yes, agencies like, the Forest Service and the BLM, these giant federal monoliths, they're getting into beaver stuff. They're doing some cool things. But, at the end of the day, this is really an animal whose fate is controlled by, county commissions, road crews, town councils, and those are levels of government that we can all influence.
Absolutely. And then I want to say for people as well, too, the Beaver Institute does have an awesome database of people who are working with beavers, whether that be in low-tech restoration-based or process-based restoration work, or in reintroduction. They have a great database of professionals that you can get in touch with if you're curious about volunteering with different groups. I know I personally have had a lot of success reaching out to people and just getting involved in that way,
Nice.
as well as other organizations too, like Volunteers for Outdoors Colorado, and wherever, there are lots of different volunteer groups like that in every state. So yeah, I'm wondering if you have anything else too. That's kind of all the questions that I have for you, but do you have any other final parting perspectives or understandings about beavers you wish people knew?
Well, I think from the fire perspective, yes, there's beavers as firefighters, but there's also beavers as post-fire responders, right? I think that's a really important thing that, that beaver dam analogs and, of course, genuine beaver dams are doing, is that they're catching, huge amounts of ash and debris that are, running off the landscape after a wildfire. And, those ash and debris flows, those can be actually really beneficial in a sense, because, we have all of these incised, degraded streams, and, that's material that, if it's impounded behind a beaver dam, can actually build that stream bed up and ultimately reconnect the stream with the floodplain. So, so getting more beaver dam analogs and genuine beaver dams back on the landscape, yes, it's good for, sort of combating these mega fires, but it's also really good for restoring streams after fires and protecting our water supplies, from those ash flows. So, before a fire, after a fire, during a fire, having beavers out there is a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, cool. Thank you so much for your time today and all of your knowledge about beavers.
Oh man, thanks for all that you do.
Thanks for joining us today. If you want to learn more about beavers, make sure to check out Ben Goldfarb's book, Eager, The Surprising Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, as well as this other award-winning environmental journalism available where books are sold and in audio format on Spotify. And make sure to follow @BlazeFireEcology on Instagram for more exciting updates about future events and an educational series from the project. See you next time.